the longest time, I've been a user of modelling devices. From the first modeler that I had was the Pod XT Live. I used to be on the John Petrucci forum and stuff, and I think part of the reason that I chose the Pod XT was because at the time I knew that Misha Mansour uses one. Now also at the time of this stuff, there were even people back then that were selling kind of little pieces of gear that would improve your tone, get rid of fizz and this kind of stuff. There's still that stuff now, but I feel like people might, you know, sell it in the form of IRs. They might give advice on channels like this one or whatever. But there is something about what people perceive to be happening in digital modeling devices and stuff that sometimes they think sounds unnatural or whatever. Now, aside from whether or not it sounds unnatural or not at all, when I got my first kind of tube amp, coming from the world of being able to manipulate this particular feature, it was something that to my ears then was something that was a little bit kind of, oh, that's there on a real amp as well. So what I'm talking about is this kind of fizzy stuff, right? And the trouble with a real amp is that unless you get an EQ and kind of use that, or unless your amp has a particularly clever EQ system, you can't do anywhere near as much to manipulate this tone as you can on a modeling device. Now, let me just show you what I'm talking about. So here's not using this particular effect or feature. So what I'm talking about today is the high cut, and you've got access to this in a couple of places within the HX Stomp. The place where I find it most useful is in the cab block or the IR block. And what I've done is I've actually mapped the expression pedal 2 to control that. So with my foot all the way down like this, I've got no cab cut at all. And with my heel down, that's all the way down at 500 Hertz. And I don't know if you agree, but for me, that fundamentally really changes the tone and the feel of the Helix, because I feel like at certain settings you get a way more kind of liquid sustaining feel. Whereas it can be quite kind of digital, piercing sounding at other settings. So let's just dig into the actual unit and talk about what's going on here. So if you don't already know, the cab block has this high cut thing, and this is a 6 dB, minus 6 dB per octave slope. So you're bringing in like a gradual, it's quite a tame musical slope to be fair. So you can have that at quite low settings before you even notice it making a difference. So here it is at sort of 10K. And it's fully open there. So at 10K, it's not really doing a whole lot. Now it's down at 8.5, 7.5 even. All the way down at 3.6. Down at 500 Hertz, obviously it's having a massive effect. So this is the one thing in the Helix that I think can make the biggest difference right away. not just the Helix, in any modeler that you have this kind of capability. So Fractal have it, Boss don't have it on the cab block. You'd have to get in there and actually set up an EQ to do this sort of thing. Line 6 also have it in the EQ block, but it's a -12 dB per octave slope, so a bit more aggressive than this one. So necessarily, if you were, you know, looking for the same kind of impact from an EQ block, you would have to set that kind of spot a bit higher than where you could have it with the cab block. Just show you on the unit now what I'm talking about, I guess. So let me just try and demonstrate for you on the actual Helix what I'm talking about. So here, this snapshot 1, we have no high cut whatsoever. This snapshot, we have the cab high cut down at 4 kHz, which is 6 dB per octave slope. The last one has that high cut off, but I'm applying a high cut with the EQ block. This is a -12 dB per octave slope. So more aggressive, and I'll show you on screen what that looks like difference wise. But here we hear the tone. So for an example, with no high cut whatsoever, and again with no reverb or delay. Here, going between the two, there's definitely more of this kind of fizziness, especially if you start to, so I'm going to get rid of this snapshot controller and instead have this drive at about 9, and you're probably going to hear even more of these kind of fizzy elements. This seems to be a thing that happens with higher gain rather than lower gain, so I don't tend to use high cut too much for clean tones. So, also, I guess the point is, if I show you something which is less rounded than the actual litigator amp, so if I show you this kind of thing with something like the PV Panama, so this, in theory, could be quite a fizzy sounding amp, depending on your settings. So we'll try the bass here, treble, 5, everything at 5. Now this may actually sound fine, let's find out together. Here, obviously, when you're going between the two, is quite a pronounced difference. So if I had this kind of treble set to about 8 without the high cut, then what we get is so the thing that I feel like it's doing for me is it's getting rid of those kind of chainsaw fizzy things, you know, that kind of B element. Obviously 4 kHz is relatively extreme, but you can experiment with this yourself. you know, try 6 kilohertz. Particularly for lead tones and single coil tones where you've got a lot of gain and you're using bridge kind of pickups, I think this is my one kind of tip for almost anything. And obviously it's just as important if you are in the cab block in this kind of way. So if we chose a single cab, so let's choose just something like the Kali V30 with a 57 mic. The default is the high cutter at, so we'll keep that there, and then I'll bring that down to 4 on the second snapshot. You get, this is the difference really. Like I say, this here is a 12 dB slope. For me, that's a little bit too aggressive, so you might, you know, want to ease that off a bit. I think the -6 dB slope is the perfect kind of musical thing. So, and also it saves you a block because you can apply it in either the cab or in the IR block. So that for me is the most powerful kind of tone shaping technique within the Helix, particularly for these higher gain tones. But equally, if you were trying to get some kind of gained up voxy tones and you were thinking, well, that sounds awfully bright, this is exactly the kind of thing that I'd be trying here as well. You know, something like the AC30 Fawn with the treble wherever. Let's see what we get. Get a bit of gain. It just, to me, has a bit more of that kind of feeling of being off axis from a speaker rather than right on top of the cone. So all that is to say that I think this is actually, for me, the key to taming quite a lot of what I see as this kind of high fizzy frequency stuff, this very present sound that we're not necessarily used to when we move across from amps to the Helix, or particularly using in-ears and headphones. This is to me like the sound of having your head right next to a speaker or on axis with it. What I feel like the high cut kind of does is gives us a bit of space from those frequencies and can help to sort of tame that spiky stuff, which is often for me what I associate with sounding unnatural, even though it is there in real amps. You know, when you hear that coming back through a PA and you're quite close to a tweeter, it's like really fizzy stuff. So by using this high cut, we can kind of balance that out a bit and just bring out more of the mids, which for me are the more pleasant tones that sound thicker. And it can totally change the balance of a tone from being quite bright and spiky to something warmer and, you know, fitting in a mix a bit neater. Of course, if you go too far, it definitely sounds like you've chucked a big blanket over the tone. But I feel like a little blanket might not be a bad thing. Let me know your comments. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you got any other go-to kind of drastic tone changing techniques? Be interested to hear them. Cheers.